The Palestine Papers and Al Jazeera investigation. Day 4, the Gaza bombshell. Was the Palestinian Authority tipped off about Israel's invasion? Evidence the PA bowed to US pressure and sabotaged the war crimes report. And an invitation for occupation. The PA invites Israeli soldiers back to the Strip. Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Al Jazeera's 4th and final release of the Palestine Papers. At this moment, all the papers from 10 years of peace negotiations in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are going online. Conversations that you were never meant to hear, right at your fingertips. The address on the screen right now. On this program, what the Palestine Papers reveal about the Gaza war. The documents hint that Israel warned the Palestinian Authority that an attack was coming. And they prove that the Palestinian Authority torpedoed the UN's human rights report on the war under pressure from the United States. We begin with Mike Hanna.
The Israeli invasion of Gaza, nearly 1,500 people killed, thousands more injured. 22 days of seismic violence in which a subsequent report found numerous war crimes were committed. Those who'd suffered through the war in Gaza, particularly the relatives of the dead, hoped the GOLDSTONE report would bring those responsible to account. But documents just revealed indicate that the Palestinian Authority struck a deal with the US to stall the process. 8 months after the war ended, members of the UN Human Rights Council were about to endorse the GOLDSTONE report, a critical step if there was to be any war crimes prosecutions in the future. The US delegation said it would vote against endorsement, but the vote was suddenly deferred, and amidst the argument and confusion it emerged that it was the Palestinians who'd pushed so hard for endorsement that were suddenly stalling it. The reason? US pressure in the form of a secret document that was presented to Palestinian negotiators in Washington on the very same day.
The Palestinian Authority will help to promote a positive atmosphere conducive to negotiations. In particular, during negotiations, it will refrain from pursuing or supporting any initiative directly or indirectly in international legal forums that would undermine that atmosphere.
There was widespread public outrage at the deferral of the vote. Under intense international pressure, the Human Rights Council reconvened and finally endorsed the GOLDSTONE report. But the impact of the 2-week hiatus reflected in a divided vote, with a quarter of the delegates abstaining. And the delay stunted the efforts of those who wanted the report entered as evidence in a war crimes trial. The Palestinian role in holding up negotiations subsequently praised by the United States.
And thank you for what you did a couple of weeks ago. It was very courageous.
On the same day, negotiator Saar Barakat was quick to ask for reward.
When can you give me something? A document or package, so I can take it to Abu Mazen, so we can study it in good faith. Now I can give Abu Mazen the minutes, but it's better if you can submit the whole thing to Abu Mazen.
Much of what I read is not controversial.
I disagree. For example, on the Palestinian Authority steps, and not going to international bodies.
This is only during negotiations.
They want to refrain from doing the illegal things that they do. If they refrain, okay, but they won't. This is my only weapon. We have action by settlers, attacks, provocations, Al-Aqsa, home demolitions, families thrown out of their homes. Either we retaliate in a civilized manner or through violence. Which one should we choose? On going to the UN, we always coordinate with you. It's our only weapon. Don't take it away from us.
But it was already given away. Regardless of US pressure, stalling the vote in the GOLDSTONE report was a decision the Palestinian leadership took by itself. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Gaza.
Well, Al Jazeera's SHERINE TADROS has been following this story. She's in Gaza right now by the ministry's compound, which was hit during the Gaza war. She joins us live. SHERINE.
Thanks, Adrian. Well, 2 years since the end of the war on Gaza, and as you can see behind me here, the rubble still litters many areas of Gaza City. A constant reminder, really, for the people here of that 23-day assault. I want to get some reaction now to this information about the Palestinian Authority stalling a vote on the Goldstone report, which was, of course, about the Gaza war. We have a guest here with us, a social worker, ADHAM KHALIL. Thank you for coming out and so late in the evening. What are your initial reactions to what we've revealed so far on this show?
Okay, first of all, I think that if we back to these days, like the Palestinians were very angry. You know, the situation was in the cast lead on the assault on Gaza was very, very like committing massacres against the Palestinian people in Gaza, and people were very angry, and they need like a quick reaction from the international community to like accusing the Israel of committing massacres.
So did the Palestinian Authority fail you in that way?
It's not like we realize that the Palestinian Authority, like they make pressure on a lot of pressure on the Palestinian Authority at that time. But I think at least the Palestinian Authority like should explain very well for the Palestinian why they delay this like voting.
So you understand that they had US pressure on them, but you think that they should have been honest with the Palestinian population. Do you think a lot of people in Gaza will have the same feelings?
But I think that people were very angry because, you know, it's like living like horrible things. At least we don't, we cannot like do anything against Israel or committing like reacting to Israel. But at the same time, we need like at least the international community of the Security Council to condemn the Israeli massacres against the Palestinian people during the cast lead.
Do you think that people here in Gaza feel that the Palestinian Authority represent them and are really trying to lift the siege in these negotiations?
Well, I think the situation is very difficult, and it's more bigger than the Palestinian Authority, and we cannot like blaming Palestinian Authority about this. For example, if we talk about the siege on Gaza, I think the one who is responsible of this like siege on Gaza is the Israeli, and we know in Gaza and in Palestine in general that there is like negotiation process between the Israeli and Palestinian Authority, but at the same time we cannot like expect that the Palestinian Authority can like do whatever and ask Israeli, and the Israeli like react by accepting it easily. It's like if we talk and move to the West Bank, our like the other side of our country, that the Israeli all the time like promising the Palestinian and the American and European, but at the same time on the ground the Israeli, even there's like a government who believe in peace at the same time in Gaza, but you know they didn't give anything for the Palestinian community. They're still attacking the people there.
Yeah, ADHAM KHALIL, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I think ADHAM's feelings are echoed around Gaza, where people have been telling us over the last few days about their sadness and disappointment in reaction to these revelations, but not necessarily their complete surprise. Adrian.
All right, Shireen, many thanks indeed. We'll get to the view from our panel in just a moment, but first give you some more detail about the UN report on the Gaza war. Now, the investigation was carried out by the former International War Crimes prosecutor and South African judge Richard Goldstone. His report was published in September 2009, and it concluded that both sides committed war crimes and deliberately targeted civilians. That Israel committed numerous serious violations of international law that were reckless, disproportionate or deliberate. That the firing of some 775 rockets into Israel by Palestinian groups was deliberate and guaranteed to cause loss of life and injury to civilians. The Goldstone report called on both sides to hold independent investigations within 6 months or risk having the cases referred to the International Criminal Court. And to date, the UN says that neither side has conducted credible and adequate investigations. Now, let's introduce our panel of experts. Ali ABUNIMAH is the co-founder of the Electronic Intifada. Patrick Theros is a former US ambassador to Qatar. And DAUD ABDULLAH is the director of the Middle East Monitor. Gentlemen, thank you. Just before we went on air, we spoke to an advisor to Abu Mazen who said that there was a perfectly rational explanation for this delay with the Goldstone vote at the UN. Ali, why do you think the PA deferred that vote on the Goldstone report?
Well, we now know from the Palestine papers that they did it under pressure from the United States, that it has been a policy priority of the United States to protect Israel from any international accountability. And in some of the papers that have been revealed in one particular set of minutes, George Mitchell mentions the ICC in particular, the International Criminal Court. So it's a U.S. policy decision to protect Israel from accountability. And look at the contrast. You had 1,400 people killed in Gaza in war crimes and crimes against humanity, as alleged by the Goldstone report, and one person killed in Lebanon, Rafiq Hariri. And there the United States is pushing for the special tribunal on Lebanon while pressuring the Palestinian Authority to not do anything that could advance the cause of justice for the victims that were killed in Israel's attack on Gaza.
Patrick Theros, is it fair for the US to pressure the Palestinians to stall the process of accountability concerning a war which, as Ali said, killed 1,400 of their people?
Fair is probably a relative term. The United States at the time was trying to seek other foreign policy objectives in the area, and I think there was a decision made in Washington that moving the Goldstone report forward too fast would be unhelpful. And the Palestinian Authority has a considerable history of trying to accommodate U.S. interests on the assumption that the only force outside that can bring the Israelis rationally to the table would be the United States.
DAUD Abdullah, let's talk about the danger of international pressure upon those who operate in the legal arena. When it comes to accountability, could the PA's deferral under US pressure set a precedent for future war crimes prosecutions, do you think?
It does. But this is the dilemma of the PA, that it is not independent. It doesn't have the capability to make its decisions by itself. Because it is funded primarily by international donors. So here we have the American envoy, saying to Saeb Erekat, issue a statement, and that is enough. But it says something about the United States also, about its value for human life, about its commitment to legality and justice. It runs short, over these principles, these international principles to which it gives so much advocacy on the international stage, and when it comes to implement them, insofar as the Palestinians are concerned, it ignores these principles. My colleague Ali gave a very good example, but there are others. In Sudan also, you have a president being indicted and strongly supported in the Security Council. When it comes to Israel, it is a different ball game, and this type of double-faced policies and attitudes towards Muslims and Palestinians and Arabs generally, this is something that stokes the instability and the antipathy towards American policy in the Muslim world.
Okay, gentlemen, just give me a moment while I bring in another revelation from the Palestine papers here, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. It's less of a revelation, I suppose, more of a question. This from a conversation between Saeb Erekat and US Middle East envoy George Mitchell in October 2009. Now, Erekat says, our trust with the government is zero. AG, and there he's referring to Israeli senior defense official Amos Gilad, spoke to Lieberman, told them about the claim that Abu Mazen was colluding with them in the Gaza war, and Erekat goes on to say that he went to Abu Mazen before the attack and asked him. Abu Mazen replied he will not go to Gaza on an Israeli tank. Abu Mazen is, by the way, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. And finally, Erekat says Amos Gilad testified about that. He was honest, so we can maintain the channel. Well, as I said, just before we went to air, I spoke to an advisor to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, Nima Hamad, and I asked him, did you bow to American pressure when you delayed the Goldstone report?
If really we were under American pressure and we postponed the voting, why we asked the meeting 1 week later on? Really, the reason I want just to let the audience understand what happened in the document. The report was 574 pages. It was presented on the 15th of September. So many delegations, for different reasons, they were not able to read the document because the report was, the first report, it was in English. It was the end of Ramadan. And so when they decided that the council will be held on the 29th and the voting will be on the 2nd of October, 68 representatives, they spoke in the meeting. And so it was for us so complicated, we were not able to be sure who will vote in favor and how many will vote against.
All right. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm sorry to interrupt you. What you're saying then is that it's a complete coincidence that there is documentary evidence in the Palestine papers saying that George Mitchell was pleading with Saeb Erekat not to pursue Israel through the courts over the Gaza war. The Goldstone report could have been the start of that process, and then coincidentally there's a delay on that vote.
Okay, I can also tell this story. In that time, Dr. Saeb Erekat, he went to Washington regarding the negotiations. It has nothing to do with the Goldstone report. Yes, Mr. Mitchell, he said that maybe this will complicate or will create difficulties. It was the position of Mr. Mitchell. It wasn't our position. This is why we insisted and we went forward, and it was voted by a great majority. If we were under pressure of Mitchell, for example, why we were under pressure on the 1st of October and not on the 8th of October, when we asked an extraordinary meeting, and it was voted 8 days later on the 19th. Sometimes really certain stories, it does not respect the intelligence of the people. Everyone today knows that we postponed in order to guarantee a certain majority in favor of the report.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Well, that was Nima Hamad, an advisor to the Palestinian president. We'll put what he had to say to our panel in a moment. But first of all, I want to bring you back, gentlemen, to that revelation we made a few moments ago, which I have to say was quite subtle. Perhaps you'd interpret it for us when we quoted Saeb Erekat talking to Amos Gilad and saying that Abu Mazen won't go to Gaza on an Israeli tank. Now, Ali, what did you read into that remark?
Well, that's a very important revelation, because what it suggests is that the Israelis had been discussing with the Palestinian Authority what might happen after an Israeli attack on Gaza, whose goal would have been to topple Hamas and to return the Abbas leadership to Gaza. And that's what that suggests to me. And the reason I believe that's the case is because when you look at the papers in totality, and I believe they're all out on AlJazeera.net tonight, you see that this was a constant obsession of the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis, how to overthrow Hamas, how to undermine Hamas and restore the Palestinian Authority to Gaza.
So essentially, the PA knew that Israel was going to go to war in Gaza.
They may not have known the exact time and the date.
Yeah.
There's no evidence they knew the exact time and the date. but there is evidence that it was discussed with them and that they were aware this would happen, and I've seen that in the documents myself.
Abdullah, Daud, picking up on what Ali was saying there about Fatah being obsessed with Hamas, the papers show time and time again that is the case. Do you think that might have influenced their thinking in their handling of this vote on the Goldstone report?
Well, yes. First of all, I concur with the view that, you know, there is a great obsession with Hamas in the documents. And to the degree that, you know, these negotiators, they have been actually, in a sense, using a form of political blackmail with the Americans and saying, well, if you don't support us, you get bin Laden, you get Aziz Drake, you get Hamas. And they even took the argument beyond Gaza and said, well, you will get the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, because if Gaza falls, Egypt would fall. Some very ludicrous, you know, arguments on their part. And despite the fact that these arguments were very superficial, somehow the Americans and the Europeans, they fell for it. It betrays their own attitude towards the Muslim world, towards the Palestinian people. They see them in very simplistic terms. Either you are a supporter of Hamas, or you're not, or you are a supporter of bin Laden, or you're not. This very simplistic, you know, approach to the Muslim world and its politics.
We'll talk more about that a little later in the program. Of course, we must point out that Nima Hamad denied any foreknowledge at all of this attack in Gaza. Let me just bring in Patrick here. Given America's standing as a world power, Patrick, why couldn't the US have pressured Israel to resume negotiations, even while the UN was investigating crimes committed by both sides? Why, in other words, why did the pressure have to be applied to the Palestinian Authority? Why couldn't the vote have gone through?
Why couldn't the vote have gone through? As I said previously, I think simply the idea felt that the Goldstone report would be a distraction from the effort. But if I could get to the subject of knowing in advance, the entire world knew in advance that there was going to be an attack. Whether, you know, at that point, it was so obvious, at least everybody I knew in Washington at the time, my recollection, is it was obvious there was going to be an attack. It was a question of time. Perhaps the intensity and the ferocity that the attack came as a bit of a surprise, but I don't think anyone should have been surprised. But one of the points we're missing here, and this is a sad thing to say, is if there is a bit player in this whole drama, it's the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority has very little authority and has few resources at its command. It at the time was hanging on, having just lost an election and then having been evicted from Gaza. Their ability to influence anything at that time was very close to nil. So, yeah, they were trying to get some traction. Yeah. But I don't think, I mean, obviously they didn't get any traction, but I think they were just trying to get traction.
Okay, gentlemen, I know you want to continue talking about this, but we could debate this for the whole hour of the program. We've got other things to reveal from the Palestine papers. Let's bring in Karma Nablusi now, who's a fellow in politics at Oxford University. Now, she's also a former PLO representative. She joins us live from Oxford. Does the organisation that you were associated with bear any resemblance to the one that we're talking about today, one that collaborated, according to the Palestine papers, so closely with Israel that it appeared to have prior knowledge of a huge military offensive?
Well, I think what you're highlighting is something that the papers have shown over the last 4 days, which is a long evolution of de-democratization, which is, you know, the big story is really about how the Americans have controlled this situation, how the Israelis, how highly colonial the process has been over all of these stages, and especially over the last decade. So it's really about our representatives having the capacity to represent us, and as these papers reveal, they really don't anymore.
As a professor of international relations, perhaps you could give us the benefit of your insight. Is it understandable, perhaps, that a governing body would set aside its grievances for the sake of what it perceives and what others perceives as perhaps as the greater good and long-term rewards, as the PA has done with the Goldstone report?
Well, I mean, this is the axiom of the entire process, which is this is all for the good of peace. But over the last 20 years, we have not had a peace process. We haven't even addressed the core of the conflict, which is the Nakba, the dispossession of the Palestinians in 1948. It's been nothing but avoiding having a real peace process since the beginning. But you talk about governance, and I think the key thing is to remember that the PA and its structure is very unrepresentative. The PA was set up in 1993 to last only for 5 years. And it is not a representative institution. It was an interim institution until there would be full independence. Obviously, everything got frozen through external constraint. Now, what you have is a few people at the top who do not represent the views of their people, but it's a larger story in that the structure is not there for them to be representative. So people try to get representation as they can, but the mechanisms that we have to represent ourselves, the Palestine National Council, where we need direct elections, not the PA, not the Legislative Council elections, all those things have been frozen, and that's where the answer lies, that the Palestinian people need direct representation on the issues that they care about, and that the PA is not able to represent them.
Okay, Karma Nabulsi, for the moment, many thanks. We'll be back with you later in the programme. But now let's move on to another revelation from the Palestine Papers. You've heard the expression, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, there's one conversation in particular that paints the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian Authority in precisely that way. Clayton Swisher takes us through it.
A key revelation from the Palestine Papers is how much time the Palestinian Authority and Israel spent not talking about the core issues of the conflict. What do they talk about instead? How to undermine Hamas and its support in Gaza. This is Gaza on January 23, 2008. Hamas bulldozes a hole in Israel's separation barrier between Egypt and the Strip. 350,000 Palestinians rush into Egypt, eager to get supplies and food, only to be forced back. 2 days later, Hamas breaches the barrier again, breaking through the so-called Philadelphia route, this border between Gaza and Egypt. This is Al Jazeera reporting from the Rafah crossing at the time.
The anger and frustration among the crowd is really building, and we've seen it erupt a number of times over the past hours. Palestinians here have had a taste of freedom for a few days, and to have that taken away is almost unbearable.
Now, a little more than a week after what you just saw, Ahmed QUREI, the head of the Palestinian delegation, sat down with Israel's foreign minister, Tzipi Livni. They were at the SHERINE Plaza Hotel in Jerusalem, and the issue of the border breach comes up. Here's what they had to say.
Did the opening of the borders appear to be a victory for Hamas?
Yes, they appear to have ended the siege.
The Egyptians don't do enough, and we're sure they can do much more.
What can you do about Philadelphia crossing?
We're not there.
You've reoccupied the West Bank, and you can occupy the crossing if you want.
We can reoccupy the Gaza Strip. What is your position?
Our strategic position is that we want a state in the West Bank and the Strip with a safe passage.
So clearly, QUREI wanted Israel to reoccupy the Philadelphia crossing. But was he really hinting the Israelis reoccupy the whole Strip as well? 3 years after a successful campaign forced them out? He avoids a straight answer to Livni's direct question, but the impression of an invitation is there. Now, at that point, 1.6 million Gazans were free to an extent from the horrors of a full Israeli occupation. The Palestine Papers show the PLO was at least thinking about trading away that hard-fought freedom and that their main enemy was Hamas rather than the Israeli occupation.
Well, let's tell you a little more about Hamas. It was formed after the first Intifada in 1987 and currently controls the Gaza Strip. Its military wing, the Al-Qassam Brigades, is known for its campaign of violent resistance against the Israeli occupation. In contrast, the civilian wing provides social services, funding schools and orphanages, mosques, healthcare and sports. And of course, it's a political party. Hamas won Palestinian elections in 2006, but much of the international community refused to accept the result and considers Hamas a terrorist organization. Well, Hamas's election victory caught many people off guard. U.S. Colonel P.J. DERMER was working in the region at the time. He tells us about the American reaction.
It was not predictable, but the signals were there that things weren't going to go exactly as the Palestinians thought they were. I saw all the behind-the-scenes pushing from Washington that we got to get these elections done. You know, they'd already been delayed once by the Palestinians. Washington argued to have them, conducted. And and then I watched the sheer reversal and terror coming out of Washington to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem about, oh my God, what happened? Why didn't we know? Number one. Number two is we can't let this stand.
We're talking about the elections.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Elections, and we got to do something foremost about Hamas. And then, of course, a little bit later, Hamas actually physically took over Gaza and took over the Fatah forces and took over forces promised by several prominent Palestinian leaders that, they would have to fight this force. And don't forget, as I said, some of those units had come out of Egypt after training.
All right, let's quickly go back to our panel. Ali ABUNIMAH, Patrick Theros, and DAUD Abdullah. Ali, I want to quote to you from the papers one more time. This is a conversation with Israeli security official Yoav Mordecai asking a PA representative, quote, how is your fight against civilian Hamas? The officers, people in municipalities, etc. This is a serious threat. Hassan Matala, the representative, replies, I don't work at the political level, but I agree we need to deal with this. And then Mordecai goes on to say Hamas needs to be declared illegal by your president. So far, it's only the militants that are illegal. What do you make of that call for President Abbas to declare Hamas as an entity illegal and not just its militants?
We'd have to check this, but I think he did actually do that after the June 2007 takeover of Gaza. But the key point about that quote is it fits into a very consistent pattern. If you look across the papers which deal with Gaza, there is, and Hamas, there is an obsession to take down Hamas on a political level, social level, military level, economic level. There's even one occasion in the papers where Saeb Erekat is complaining to George Mitchell, or telling George Mitchell about how the Israelis are not doing enough to keep Gaza besieged. So it runs all the way through the documents.
Patrick Theros, the papers show that the EU wanted to engage with Hamas. We read a quote yesterday where EU envoy Mark Otte tells Saeb Erekat that the EU has to deal with the realities of a Hamas government and that the EU would encourage Hamas to change and make things work. Why can't the US take that sort of pragmatic view of Hamas?
Well, the EU didn't stay with that view very long. I remember shortly thereafter an interview with the, I'm trying to remember her name right now, senior moment, the lady who was in charge of the relationship with the Middle East, who was asked repeatedly on European television, well, why aren't you accepting the results of an election? Why, and she kept coming up with the most convoluted answers. There were those of us in Washington at the time arguing, and still believe that perhaps the most serious mistake we made was not accepting the elections and then dealing with Hamas as the government of the Palestinian Authority, put them on the spot, let them fail. Don't give them an excuse to say that we're at fault. So
why would you want them to fail?
No, if they're going to fail, then let them fail. If the propaganda is all true, if the stories about where they stand and so forth are all true, then they will fail of their own weight. If not, they will act responsibly.
All right. Daud Abdullah, is it fair for the US to still label Hamas a terrorist organization, given that as an organization it's obviously so much more than just a military wing? How much of a difference would it make in the region as a whole if the US changed its attitude to Hamas and was a little more pragmatic?
Well, it should have been for a very long time ago, because the US sat down and spoke to Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland at a time when Sinn Féin had not given up its weapons, you see. And they came to an agreement, the peace agreement in Northern Ireland. So there's nothing really except Israeli pressure on the Americans, that rejects a dialogue, a constructive dialogue with Hamas on this matter. But it should be noted, however, that behind the scenes, there are contacts. Many Europeans, they go to meet Hamas officials in Damascus, in Lebanon, and elsewhere. They conduct these negotiations behind the scenes. What is required from them is to be forthright and public and transparent in the negotiations with all the factions in Palestine.
All right, gents, for the moment, many thanks. Now, the Palestine Papers are also a window into the murky world of Arab politics. Next on this Al Jazeera Network special, criticising Qatar, the meetings and the minutes accusing the Gulf nation of supporting Hamas. Also ahead on the programme, how you can see the Palestine Papers for yourself. Details of how to access them coming up right here on Al Jazeera. Welcome back. This is the Palestine Papers, the final release. Now, over these last 4 days, Al Jazeera has revealed some of the most alarming findings from a cache of more than 1,600 documents. Now, we've published them all. Minutes, memos, maps and emails. But let's just take a moment to remind you of the revelations themselves. Day one, Jerusalem. We showed you how PLO chief negotiator Saeb Erekat offered Israel the biggest Yerushalayim in Jewish history, annexing every settlement in East Jerusalem bar one. And he offered to be creative in talks about Islam's third holiest site, the Haram al-Sharif. Day two, refugees. We released papers showing how the PA offered to trade millions of Palestinian exiles' right of return in exchange for a state. Day three, security. We revealed how PA forces colluded with Israel to battle Hamas and even killed their own people, and how the British spy agency MI6 drew up a plan to abduct and detain the PA's opponents. And now we're focusing on Gaza and how the US pressured the PA into giving up on a UN report on war crimes. Now, the Palestinian Authority's Interior Minister has denied those claims that the PA sanctioned the Israeli hit on a Fatah-affiliated fighter. The Palestine Papers document this exchange between Nasser Yousef and Shaul Mofaz, the Israeli defense minister. Mofaz says to Yousef, "Hassan Madhoun, we know his address, and Rashid Abu Shabak knows that." Shabak was head of security in Gaza at that point. "Why don't you kill him? Hamas fired because of the elections, and this is a challenge to you and a warning to Abu Mazen." Yousef replies, "We gave instructions to Rashid, and we'll see." Now Yousef has given a different version of the meeting to Al Jazeera.
Shaul Mofaz said you don't know what's going on the ground, and if it continues like this, when we are approaching the withdrawal from Gaza, we might have to deal with the exchange of fire in a different way. What about Hassan Madhoun? Why don't you arrest him? He didn't say kill him, he said arrest him, since no Israeli can tell us to kill a Palestinian. And when Israel said we want to kill Hassan Madhoun, they knew this could not happen, because we would inform Madhoun. Believe me, that the Palestinian blood is a red line for us.
Now, a quick reminder that you can see the entire set of Palestine Papers online right now at our special website. And Greg Karlstrom has just finished uploading the final documents, and he's also got some reaction for us. Greg.
Adrian, a surprising endorsement for the Palestine Papers coming in from the Israeli government. The Jerusalem Post reporting just now that Gilad Erdan, he's an Israeli cabinet minister, called them a blessing, and he said that they revealed the truth of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. All of these 1,600 files are now up on our website. We faced some allegations over the last few days that we've taken these papers out of context, that we've distorted them. So what we would invite you to do is to go to our website at transparency.aljazeera.net to view and to download all of these files. They give you sort of a front row seat into these negotiations that were never meant to be public, and they offer some insight into how the negotiators spoke to one another. To take you through one of the more interesting exchanges that we have, it's minutes of a meeting from October 2009. This is when Saeb Erekat, the Palestinian Authority's envoy, met with George Mitchell, the U.S. Middle East envoy. This is about right after Israel agreed to its 9-month settlement moratorium in the West Bank. So he goes to Washington to talk to U.S. diplomats, and they cover a lot of ground. They discuss Obama's new plan for peace talks and what sort of terminology they'll use. Like, instead of the word treaty, we have outcome. The U.S. envoy Mitchell asks Erekat if he liked Obama's speech, presumably a reference to his Salam Aleikum speech in Cairo 4 months earlier. Erekat replies, "We like parts." And there are lots of other colorful exchanges, too. At one point, Erekat says even rabbits have defense mechanisms, and he makes some interesting revelations about the papers. You can check all of this out at our website. It's transparency.aljazeera.net. That's all from me. Enjoy the documents. Adrian?
Greg, many thanks indeed. And Saeb Erekat, you mentioned there, has had much more to say to Al Jazeera about the Palestine Papers. This in the last hour.
I'll admit that some of the papers you published are authentic, but some are fake, such as the one on the biggest Jerusalem. But I challenge Al Jazeera to publish the official positions of the PA, which is in my possession, so that Palestinians around the world know the facts, and so that they can keep their head above the sand. You've taken all documents out of context. You're destroying our aspirations.
Now, as you know, Israel, the Palestinian Authority and the United States are the main players in the Palestine Papers. However, most countries in the Middle East are involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in one way or another. After all, the region's gone to war 3 times over the issue. Let's take a look at the neighborhoods. Now, here is Israel and the West Bank. And here's Egypt and Jordan. Both are officially at peace with Israel, and both now fund and train Palestinian Authority security forces. Egypt's also the mediator on the conflict between the PA and Hamas. Lebanon and Syria are still officially at war with Israel. Both are aligned with Iran, which in turn backs Hamas. Now, the Gulf is a little more of a grey area. Most countries have informal relations with Israel. Saudi Arabia launched the Arab Peace Initiative, which essentially seeks to normalize Arab relations with Israel. Qatar, where I am right now, also has a very active role in the region. Clayton Swisher takes a look now at how Qatar is portrayed in the Palestine Papers.
The Palestine Papers show how the U.S., Israel, and the Palestinian Authority see Iran and Hamas in the same way, clear connected enemies. There's little doubt about that. But they also show how much they feared Hamas was getting support right here in Qatar. Negotiators on both the Israeli and Palestinian side complain about Qatar's role time and time again. In April 2008, the Palestinian security chief, Hazem Attallah, says someone from Qatar is funding one of the terrorist groups. Senior PLO official Ahmed QUREI responds, "Why did you mention Qatar?" And Attallah says because Hamas is funded from Qatar. And at that point, Zivi Livni says she canceled a visit to Qatar because they fund Hamas. Later that year, Chief PLO negotiator Saab Erekat is recorded in a meeting summary as personally asking the emir to stop playing games. Meeting minutes in 2009 show Erekat telling the U.S. that Qatar's emir has been personally calling intellectuals, telling them to attack Mahmoud Abbas in relation to the Goldstone investigation. Now, turning to this channel now, in August 2008, Ahmed QUREI accuses Al Jazeera of, quote, praising Hamas victories, and in September says Al Jazeera is not our friend, they are with Hamas. The documents reveal the annoyance shared by both Israelis and the Palestinian Authority at Qatar's foreign policy, especially when it comes to the Middle East conflict.
Well, in response to those allegations made by the Palestinian Authority against Al Jazeera, this is the network's official statement. Al Jazeera is a global news organization that devotes a great deal of its resources and airtime to covering the conflict in the Middle East. At all times, the channel adheres to the highest editorial standards and offers viewers impartial, balanced and in-depth coverage of events in the region and beyond. To underline our commitment to transparency and accountability, we're publishing all of the documents in the Palestine Papers online, including the allegations made against Al Jazeera. Back to our panel now. Ali ABUNIMAH, Patrick Theros and DAUD Abdullah. DAUD Abdullah, what do you make of the fact that the PA is talking in such a critical way, not about Al Jazeera, but about Qatar, their Arab brothers, to, of all people, Israeli officials?
Yeah, I think the problem with the PA here is that if you have something to hide, then you would have a problem with Al Jazeera. That's to begin with, because you will be exposed. And so these people are very nervous with Al Jazeera's, media trajectory, how it it conducts its coverage of issues. But on another level, with the relationship with the government during the war, after the war, there was a summit in Qatar, and Mahmoud Abbas was invited to Qatar. He didn't want to come. He said, I can't get a passport out. I can't, And then the foreign minister of Qatar said, I can get the passport out so you can come to Qatar. And let's discuss what's happening in Gaza. At the end of it, he didn't show up. You see, because they have a problem of being open, of being standing up, showing to the people of the region that they can stand up for the Palestinians and not for America, not for Israel, not for the occupation. This is what they have shown when they refused to come to Qatar, that their interest was on the side of the occupation.
Ali, let's talk about this accusation that Qatar funds Hamas. Is Qatar partial to Hamas, do you think? What is Qatar's stance concerning the internal Palestinian politics?
Well, I think that the role Qatar has tried to play is one of a mediator, which means not taking the side of Fatah or not taking the side of Hamas. And I think that Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, interprets that as being against it. But if you look at Qatar's regional role, or the role they're trying to play, or how they see themselves, it's a mediator. They've tried to play that role with Lebanon. While I've been here in Doha, there has been the Darfur peace talks going on here in Doha at the same time. I think they've tried to play a similar role in Palestine. But the Palestinian Authority position is, if you're not with us, 150% you're against us. And we've seen that in some of Saeb Erekat statements tonight as well.
Patrick Theros, former US ambassador to Qatar, the US continues to list Hamas as a terrorist organization. In the light of your experience, do you think that Qatar is funding Hamas?
No, I see no reason. Frankly, what the Qataris just did with Tunisia, where the official statement saying whatever the Tunisian people want, we support that. I think that's exactly their attitude towards Hamas. Hamas won elections.
Okay. Patrick, many thanks. Now, as you saw in Clayton's earlier report, the Palestinian Authority's disdain for Al Jazeera is pretty clear in the confidential documents. And now that they've been leaked and are out in the public domain, that criticism has intensified. From the chants to the banners, the message has been clear. Al Jazeera, responsible for leaking the Palestine papers. Al Jazeera, the enemy. Faced with more than 1,600 documents, which has left the Palestinian Authority facing a barrage of difficult questions about their role and their very existence, this is what they had to say.
Just as we're starting to achieve more recognition in the world for Palestinian national rights for an independent state with East Jerusalem as its capital, this campaign came. So we ask ourselves, what are the interests of Al Jazeera? What are the interests of Qatar in their campaign against us?
And this from Saeb Erekat, the chief Palestinian negotiator, one of the main players in the papers.
Al Jazeera is saying that we are guilty until we get executed, and after our execution we should get an unfair trial. That's called neutral journalism 2011 Jazeera style. I challenge Al Jazeera to publish the Palestinian official papers and positions on Jerusalem, borders, settlement, refugees, and all other issues.
That's a challenge we're happy to accept, and the full 10 years' worth of documents are now online. And just as they may reveal answers to long-held suspicions, they'll also throw up many more questions. Questions the Palestinian Authority will now be tasked with answering. Well, let's get a view on what you've just seen from Mark Perry, a foreign policy analyst in Washington, D.C., and once again, Kama Nabulsi, a fellow in politics at Oxford University. Mark Perry, we'll start with you. I know, Mark, that you've studied the papers in great detail now over some time. What do you think? Should they have been published? Are you satisfied it's in the public interest to have released them?
I think it's possible to criticize Al Jazeera for their focus and for their lead. I argued in the week before they were released that the focus here should be on George Mitchell and the U.S. and the abandonment of American principles. But we, all of our experts at Al Jazeera, agreed that the focus instead should be on the unprecedented concessions made by the Palestinians to the Israelis, and I agreed with that. So I think it's possible to criticize Al Jazeera, but on the other hand, there's no conspiracy involved here. There's no underhanded agenda that's being enacted here. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with Al Jazeera. Any of your viewers, any of your listeners can go online and read the papers for themselves. Make up your own mind. That's what democracy is all about. And you can even comment on the papers online. I know of no other network, Fox, CNN, the BBC, that allows this kind of access. So I praise Al Jazeera for what they've done.
In the light of everything, Mark, that the papers reveal, do you think the PA will be able to continue as the official representatives of the Palestinian people? I mean, what happens next is what I'm asking you.
I think it's going to be very difficult, and if I'm not a Palestinian, maybe I can't advise them, but if I were them, I think that I would rethink their position. I would work for reconciliation with Hamas. I would stop talks with the United States and Israel until they live up to their principles. I would call a national election and form a new leadership, and stop. Let's have Palestinians stop pointing guns at each other, and let's have the Palestinian people united. I think that's the way forward. I think that Abu Mazen, Saeb Erekat, and the leadership should really forge reconciliation with Hamas and provide a united front to the United States and Israel.
Kamana Bulsi, where did it go so wrong for these Palestinian officials, the PLO once seen as heroes, fighting for their homeland? Now their purpose seems pretty unclear, other than perhaps fighting for their political survival.
Well, I think we've seen the reaction of certain officials this week, which you've been showing over the program. What we haven't yet seen is the reaction of the Palestinian people, but that is certainly coming, and that will come over the next days and weeks. And that's because the Palestinian people themselves are disgusted with the cleavages. They're disgusted with the unrepresentative positions. It is the Palestinians that want national unity. And you know, when the breakdown began, the political prisoners went on strike for weeks, urging national unity. There was a very important document written by all of the parties in prison called the National Conciliation in 2005, I think it was, where it's very clear that unless we get our people, all of our citizens, all of the Palestinians who are being discussed in these negotiations, and I would say especially, but not exclusively, the Palestinian refugee community, who is the majority of the Palestinian people and have not been able to participate in electing their officials. And it is only through that way, the democratic deficit is so large that you will see Palestinians coming together to try to create that self-representation again, because strong negotiators, I mean, first of all, don't negotiate when there's nothing to negotiate about. But your representatives should represent you, and the Palestinian people, our young generation all over the world, in refugee camps everywhere, the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. It's not about Fatah or Hamas, it's about coming together to create our own representative political platform. And so that's definitely the next step to come, and I have no doubt that it will.
Kamana Bulsi, Mark Perry, for the moment, many thanks to you both. I want to fit in one more revelation from the papers before we go. Another exchange from October 2009. In it, Saeb Erekat tells U.S. officials that Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas helped to secure funding for the Iranian opposition, led by Mir Hossein Mousavi. And what you're about to hear is an audio reenactment of that conversation. Here it is.
10 days ago, we had to convince a Palestinian businessman to pay $50 million for Mousavi to have a radio station.
And let's look at another quote 2 years earlier, 3 months after the Hamas coup in Gaza. Saeb Erekat talking about peace negotiations with U.S. Security Coordinator Keith Dayton. He says failure here will mean failure of the moderate camp in the Arab world. Egypt, Jordan and Saudi Arabia may collapse, and I can see how some in Israel will be willing to strike a deal with Hamas on a ceasefire. Let's go back to our panel. I'll ask you about that second quote in just a moment. But first, Ali ABUNIMAH, what's your reaction to what you heard about the fact that the PA might, in Erekat's words, have spent $50 million on a radio station for the Iranian opposition leader?
Or trying to broker that.
Yeah.
To get, well, you know, Erekat says in one of the documents to Condoleezza Rice, in a meeting with Condoleezza Rice, you know, we are part of the greater Middle East. This was the Bush administration initiative. Basically, we're at your service. And that's the kind of thing. They're trying, in a sense, to become a client regime of the United States.
DAUD, Abdullah, that exchange between Saeb Erekat and Keith Dayton, when he said failure here will mean failure of the moderate camp in the Arab world. Throughout the papers, we've seen him offering for the PA to act as a buffer against what he calls Islamist forces, whether it be Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah. I mean, what's he trying to achieve there?
He's trying to impress the Americans, because the whole, you know, the American policy in the region is based on the premise of, you know, you have a war of terror. Hamas is in the camp of the terrorists, and therefore there are no holes barred we should do everything to destroy them. This was the commitment they gave in the roadmap in 2003. And every policy that was pursued thereafter was against Hamas. Whether we speak of Gaza or we speak of the West Bank, it was within that context of the commitments given by Abbas and his group in 2003 against what they call the infrastructure of terror. However, Israel gave certain commitments to dismantle the settlements. What did they do about it since 2003? We know absolutely nothing.
Patrick Theros, as a diplomat, what do you think of Arafat's approach? Is it effective?
It's a pathetic attempt to curry favor.
Right.
And that's about it.
And that's about it. Okay. Look, we're almost out of time. I just want to give you all some time for a final thought, 30 seconds each, on not just what we've heard today, but what you've read and learned from the papers. There's 1,600 documents that you've got. Ali, let's start with you.
Like I said at the beginning of these 4 days, this is a bombshell. It's going to take time for all the ripples to go out. People need to study these papers. But one conclusion I've reached is the peace process, as we know it for the past 2 decades, is dead. It's time for an approach based on equal rights, putting pressure on Israel, grassroots movement through boycott, divestment and sanctions. Meetings behind closed doors is not going to bring peace and justice.
Patrick Theros, do you agree with that?
In general, frankly, there's very little that I've read in the papers so far that wasn't either common knowledge in Washington or even reported in much of the American press. What the papers point out is essentially 2 things: the pointlessness of the current approach, and secondly, amazingly that the Israelis never agreed to any of this.
DAUD Abdullah.
Well, it demonstrates to us why we have taken 20 years to get where we are. And if we continue along these lines, we would take another 20 and still not achieve anything. Why? Because the Palestinian leadership is very weak and inadequate. The Israelis are intransigent, and the Americans are in collusion with them.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you. Ali ABUNIMAH, DAUD Abdullah, Patrick Theros, many thanks. Now, we have a special debate in Washington, D.C. on Thursday at 2000 hours GMT. The Palestine Papers lifted the lid on a political process that failed. A special panel in the United States is going to debate what President Obama should do next. And what about Plan B? Israelis and Palestinians under one rule. Why Israel's in 2 minds about a one-state solution. In the meantime, you can read the Palestine Papers for yourself, all 1,600 of them, now online. Just go to transparency.aljazeera.net and follow the instructions. I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Al Jazeera.